Hello everybody, Jake here from Bearded Gear. Today I wanted to show you something that has surprised me. I think I've owned this knife for about 1.5 years now, maybe 2 years even. And it's a kind of a gateway knife for me, if you will. I had carried knives my entire life, and literally ever since I was a small kid, I had a knife in my pocket. And this knife was kind of when I started to dabble in collecting knives. I always had maybe 3 or 4 knives, and they were all users, things that I carried all the time. But this was a knife that I got just because it looked kind of new and exciting. I was a little bit bored in life in general, and so I was looking for a new hobby to pick up. And I found this knife online, watched a review or two about it, and decided to just give it a shot. And at the time, I think this knife was about 70 bucks, and that was a pretty significant purchase for me on a knife, just on a whim. I had usually purchased most of my knives from places like Big Five, or they were gifts from like my dad, who would give me nicer knives, but this was one of the first knives that I purchased just because I thought it was cool, and it was just kind of for the sake of the hobby. I obviously intended to use it and carry it as well, but I didn't need a knife at the time. There was no reason to be getting a new one. It just seemed like something fun to do. So I went ahead and purchased this Boker Lateralus. This is a JB Stout design, and it's part of the Boker Plus line, which I think is kind of their mid-level knives. It's not their high-end knives, but it's not their bottom-of-the-barrel stuff either. It's a D2 blade. I believe it runs on bearings. I've actually never taken this knife apart, so I'd have to double check that, but I'm almost certain it does. You've got a G10 show scale with awesome milling on it that gives it this great texture, even though the G10 is pretty smooth otherwise. And then it's a steel frame lock. This knife is just awesome. The second that I got this knife in hand, I loved it. First of all, I think the blade shape is awesome with this kind of clip point here. It's got a lot of belly, which makes it super usable, and it's got this great fuller. The jimping works for me. The blade just makes a ton of sense. This forward choil I can get my finger into so I can choke up on the knife, and it works great. I think everything about this blade just works and is really, really well thought out. Being D2, it's a great steel that's fairly easy to sharpen, holds an edge decently well. It's just a really good user steel in my opinion. And that's what this knife has become. Because this knife now, compared to a lot of the other knives in my collection that kind of snowballed from that initial decision to try this one out, now this is probably my least expensive knife that actually makes it into pocket relatively regularly. I find that I love to put this knife into my pocket when I'm going to be doing like some house chores in the backyard, stuff like that, where I know I'm going to be pretty rough on whatever knife I put in pocket, but I still want to carry something that's fun and enjoyable to use. And so I've put this knife through its paces, absolutely. Over time, I have done all kinds of gnarly stuff with this. You can see if you look closely at the edge, it's due for a strop and a sharpening, or a sharpening and a strop, I should say. But it holds its edge really well for being D2. I feel like they did a heat treat great on this, and yeah, it goes to work and it excels. And it's relatively heavy, being a steel frame lock, but it's not overly heavy. I've definitely got heavier knives. The G10 show side works great. There's no liner in the G10, it's just G10 in there, but I found that the lockup is super solid. There's virtually no side to side or front to back blade play. It locks up great, and being steel, you don't need a frame lock insert, and yeah, it just locks up solid every time. I love that I can deploy it with my middle finger. I love that the flipper also works great. It's just a super well executed knife for the money. This knife works great in any grip I put it in, and yeah, it's just a kind of a user dream. The one thing I will say that I don't appreciate about this knife is the pocket clip. First of all, I think aesthetically it's just not the most pleasing pocket clip, but more importantly, the way that it goes in pocket, it's a really stiff clip. There's not much spring to it, and the way that it sits right next to the cutout for the frame lock, and just kind of the placement of it and how shallow it is, it's not the most pleasant knife to get in and out of pocket. It's not the worst. There's definitely far worse pocket clips that I've experienced, but I will say If this knife had a fantastic pocket clip that just worked really, really great, it would go in my pocket a lot more. I definitely sometimes decide against it because I just don't want to deal with the hassle of having to kind of put my other hand to brace the pocket while I shove this in, and having it snag and have to pull a little bit harder than I'd like to get it out of pocket. It's just not ideal. It works, but it could certainly be better. Other than that, for the money, I think that this is just arguably the most fun and most usable knife you can buy at this price point for being D2 steel. I know now there are quite a few newcomers to the game, a lot of knives like the Civivi line and the CJRB line from Artisan, and I've tried some of those knives. I've really liked them, and I will say they've probably got better actions than this one does. Although, I still like this knife better. I feel like the character of this knife, the way it works, the form and function of it, just speaks to me. And so I really, really like this knife. I think it's also definitely the cheapest way you can get a Stout designed knife. I don't know of any other collaborations that he's done. I could totally be wrong. I shouldn't say it definitely is. I know they also just did kind of a smaller version of this knife from Boker, so I'll be getting one of those soon. But yeah, the Lateralus is a great EDC knife for the money, and I'd recommend it to anybody who's looking for something in this price range, or even somebody who's looking above this price range. I think it's a great, solid, sturdy knife that you can depend on and rely on. And with how much I've used it, it's easy to put my name behind saying that it's fantastic. So I'm gonna go ahead and step in front of the camera for a moment here, talk about some more of my thoughts about it, and give you kind of a diagnosis on the way that I feel about the Lateralus. All right, so like I said in the close-up, this knife has just been excellent for me. I really love it when I find a knife that just works well in actual application. I've had several knives that on paper should have worked great for me. But then when I got them in hand and tried to put them through cardboard or rope or whatever it was that I went to do to actually cut with the knife, they just kind of fell apart for me. They didn't literally fall apart as in come into pieces, but the ergos from my hands didn't work, or the blade geometry didn't work very well, or something about it just didn't quite add up. The great thing about this knife is that for the low price that I got it, I think it was around 70 bucks, like I believe I mentioned, there's just nothing about this knife that's a deal breaker for me, especially at that price point. I think even if this knife was a little over 100 bucks, I'd still recommend it to people because it's that great of a design. In execution, it's also super fun to fidget with, which may not be important to a lot of people, but to me, as somebody who fidgets with my knives all day long, I really like a knife that I can play with and it's fun to do that. It feels very tactile, it's got a great action. For $70, this thing glides. It just works. You've got the flipper tab, you've got the fuller, which you can deploy with your middle finger. If you kind of jam your finger in there, you can go ahead and just pull it open with the fuller. There's so many ways to open this knife, and each one of them works well and is fun. The lockup is solid every single time. It's been nothing but reliable. Disengaging the lock, they've got this geometry nailed. So it's a little bit taller, a little bit prouder on the lock side than it is on the G10 side. So you're able to kind of feel that ramp super easily. It's also milled out internally a little bit on each side, so you've got a nice big pocket to stick your thumb into, and it's just easy every single time to disengage. I've had no issues with this lock, no issues with deployment, and it's just been a dream of a budget knife. This may not be a budget knife to some people. When I first bought it, it wasn't a budget knife. This was one of the nicer knives that I owned. But once you get a little bit deeper into this hobby and you own some knives, like I've been lucky to own that are hundreds of dollars, this becomes fantastic for the money, because a lot of these features are things that you're looking for much more expensive knives to nail. And this knife nails it at a relatively low price point. You've got great centering, great lockup, great action, great ergos, great blade geometry, decent blade material. If this was a titanium frame lock and had like a carbon show scale and was M390 or something like that, this would easily be a $250 knife. I will say at that point they would probably have to do something about the clip as well, but if they did like a cool milled titanium clip or a loop over deep carry clip, something like that, this knife would kill, I believe, at that price point in those kind of fancier materials. But yeah, I believe if you really like this knife and want to get something just like it that's dressed up, JB Stout probably makes this knife. It's one of his models, so you could ultimately just get a custom. I imagine that would be quite a bit more expensive than the $70 version of this Boker though. So yeah, that's kind of the conundrum with knives in general. That's a story for another time. But this is a great way to get an awesome design that works well, and yeah, it's just, I believe Boker knocked it out of the park with this one. It's one of those knives that surprised me and kind of snowballed me deeper into the hobby, which is a really cool thing. I love it when I stumble into something that takes me further and deeper. The last knife that did that for me was probably my Koenig Arius. It was the first really expensive knife that I bought, and that knife changed the hobby for me because I started to look at every knife after it differently, because I compared everything against it. How can you not when you own something that's that fantastic? So my tastes evolved after having that knife, and I probably never would have gotten to the Koenig Arius or these things since if I hadn't started with the Boker Lateralus by JB Stout, because this definitely changed my knife taste, got me into some things that led to a much more what I would call a refined palate. Obviously that's always a work in progress. I'm always trying new stuff and learning more about what I like and appreciate in knives, but this is something that I'm probably just going to keep forever because it did that to my collection. It started a new trend and kind of a new hobby that I intend to carry for my entire life, because I carry a knife everywhere I go. So that's a bit of rambling and a lot of words for just a story of how great this knife is. Really, really like the Boker Lateralus, and I can't say enough good stuff about it, especially for the price point.